I decided to make this video look a bit brighter. We'll see how it goes. I've talked a lot about how much I love modern Gothic historical fiction. I've made I don't know how many videos on it, quite a few. I recently did a video on my absolute favourite modern Gothic creepy historical fiction author Laura Purcell and her newest book, The Shape of Darkness. Now I'm going to talk about Stacey Halls. Stacey Halls, at the time of recording, has released two novels, The Familiars and The Foundling, both in beautiful hardcover, which I was lucky enough to get my hands on, and I finally read them both. I got The Foundling for Christmas, and I found The Familiars. Is that ironic? It's not ironic. I found it in a charity shop. Anyway, I had my eye on Stacey Halls' writing for a while because she falls into that category of modern Gothic historical fiction writing that I like so much, alongside authors like the aforementioned Laura Purcell, Sarah Collins, Anita Frank, Kieran Millward Hargrave, Bridget Collins, etc, etc, etc. So Stacey Halls fits nicely into this bracket, and I finally got around to reading both of her novels. What I'm going to do is talk about both of them, compare them a little bit, talk about which one is my favourite and why, and kind of run down whether or not you should read them. Let's start with The Familiars, because this was her debut novel, and it became a Sunday Times bestseller. It was pretty all over the place when it first came out, and it sits somewhere between historical fiction, Gothic fiction, genre fiction, and pretty accessible commercial fiction. It's a really, really easy read. It's a pretty well-paced story. It's about 400 pages, and everything about it is accessible and chill. It's very, very British. It's a genuinely lovely piece of historical fiction. I read it after The Foundling, and I have to say immediately up front, I do prefer The Foundling to The Familiars, but I still found The Familiars to be a very worthwhile read, and something that I came away from feeling pretty positive. So what's it about? So The Familiars, as I read in the notes at the back, is actually based on a real place, a real group of people. The protagonist of this book did exist. It's set in 1612, and it has a few references to Shakespeare, which is fun. The protagonist's dog is called Puck, and our protagonist has a wonderful name. Her name is Fleetwood Shuttleworth, and as I said, she was real. She was a real mistress of a, what were they called, stately home. She was a lord, a landlord, posh person, rich person in the early 17th century. And this is set in Lancashire. This is at a time where King James genuinely believed that the country was ravaged quietly by witches. I remember studying Macbeth when I was in school, and King James actually put out a book about witches and witchcraft and catching witches, and that book is mentioned later on in this book. So there is this wonderful backdrop, this terrifying backdrop, where mostly the women, the mostly poor women, working class women, mostly in the north. I can't imagine why poor working class women of the north were so vilified by the rich male southerners. What are you gonna do? But they were. So they were vilified, they were chased, and our protagonist, Fleetwood, is kind of in the middle of all of this. Slowly she falls deeper into the middle of it. But the book begins with her receiving a note from her doctor, or her husband, Richard, received a note from the doctor. Fleetwood has miscarried 3 times. She's only 17, and pretty much her whole life is trying to sire a son for her rich lord of a husband. And she keeps failing. Failing's not the right word, but she's not succeeding at carrying a child through, giving birth to it and raising it. She keeps miscarrying. And she's pregnant now for the 4th time, and this note that has arrived into the hands of her husband, but she got her hands on it first, the note says that she will not survive another pregnancy, that she is doomed to die in childbirth. And of course she's now pregnant and she's terrified, she's panicked. A lot of threads follow on from this point that are absolutely fascinating, that continue on right until the very end, when a few revelations start to come out that you really don't see coming at first. But near the beginning of the book, Fleetwood bumps into this young working class girl who is out hunting, accidentally hunting on Fleetwood's husband's land. And her name is Alice Gray. And she is really our second protagonist. She becomes a good friend and the midwife of Fleetwood. Now this book is pretty slow going. It's all set across a series of just a few months, following Fleetwood as she's becoming more and more pregnant, more and more frightened. She's bleeding occasionally and showing signs that the child isn't healthy and or she isn't healthy. And she starts to latch on to Alice, this young midwife, as kind of her solution, her protector, her guardian, and also her dear friend. Meanwhile, Richard, Fleetwood's husband, is proving to be a colossal arsehole. Shocker. He's a very, very rich landlord. And he's becomes an increasingly scary person. Through a few flashbacks and just what Fleetwood says about him, they used to be a happier couple. He used to be a happier guy. She's only 17, and she got married off to him. Her family home was gifted to him, and it's now kind of in disrepair, in disuse. And Fleetwood's mother was also a very rich person. She's still alive. She now lives in a different place. She comes into the story a few times. And Fleetwood is unhappy. She despises her mother. She and Richard are slowly hating each other more and more, and Fleetwood is constantly beset by these horrible nightmares of a wild boar attacking her. And that does come in later in the book. It's quite interesting. There's nothing supernatural here. This is a book about witch hunting to an extent. It is a book about prejudice, about hatred, about different social groups to an extent, but none of it is too heavy. It's very, very claustrophobically focused on Fleetwood and her journey, her pregnancy, and her journey becoming friends with Alice, and how that factors into Fleetwood's situation, her marriage, the world that she lives in, the land that she lives in, and these very, very clear comparisons between rich and poor. Overall, I think The Familiars is a worthwhile story to read. There is nothing too complex about it. It touches on a lot of interesting social issues. It feels very faithful to the period. It feels like an early 17th century book, except that the language isn't complex in any way. And it seems like Stacey Halls really did her homework with it. I'm not a 17th century historian. I cannot say whether it is entirely faithful, but there are details here and there that are really comforting and feel grounded in the world. So if you love historical fiction, it's absolutely worth your time. You've probably already read it. If you haven't, yeah, it's great. However, Stacey Hall's second book, The Foundling, I think is a hugely superior book. I will get my one criticism, and I have only one criticism of this book out of the way, and I promise I'm not about to spoil anything, I guess, in that the ending of this book is a little too happy. In fact, the ending to both books is really, really happy. Both books end in a perfect kind of fairy tale happy way. I won't give you the context of the ending for either book, but they both just really end in a perfectly happy, everyone's at peace, everything is wrapped up with a nice neat bow kind of a way. And with The Foundling, it kind of works, and with The Familiars it kind of works, and yet I did feel, I don't know, disappointed. Maybe I like sad endings. Maybe it felt like it was a little too twee, a little too cheerful. I'm not really sure. But both times I finished these books and I was like, that kind of all worked out a little too well. It's a weird criticism to have, but it's mine. And other than that, this is a really great book. I would say this is where Stacey Halls is now proving herself. The Familiars was a good book. This is a great book. So what's it about? The Foundling follows two protagonists, whereas The Familiars had two protagonists, but only one of them was our narrator. Her first-person narrator was Fleetwood. Here we have two narrators, two first-person narrators, and the book flits between them, part one, part two, part three, and the book really feels like it is in three distinct acts, which really helps with the structure. It is very, very well segmented, and it helps with the pace. The Familiars starts pretty slow. The first, 3 or 4 chapters are slow going, and they introduce us to the most boring side characters, one of whom becomes a kind of villain as the book goes on, but he's not interesting. Fleetwood's husband has all of these terrible friends who are all the same. His name's Richard, and his friends are called Roger and Raymond and Richmond, and I don't know, they're all such dull, rich, upper-class, white men. I hate them all, I can't tell the difference between them, and then one of them is a villain and I can't remember his job because he's the same as the other guy. But here, the characters are a lot clearer. It has a lot more of a focus. Everything is narrowed down and condensed a little bit. There is a greater focus here. Stacey Halls has managed to streamline everything a little bit more for this narrative, and it follows two very, very different women. You can tell that Stacey Halls has a kind of a theme, she has a kind of a brand, it's historical fiction, but this one is actually set about 150 years after The Familiars. It's not a sequel in any way, I'm just pointing out that was set in 1612, and this is set around around 1750, so mid-18th century, and it follows a very, very poor young woman who works at a market stall that her dad runs, and her name is Bess. And Bess has unfortunately gotten pregnant really, really young. She's in her late teens. She's gotten pregnant, and so she goes to, drop the book, she goes to The Foundling, which is a real hospital in London that takes unwanted children. It's an orphanage. They raise children, you provide them with a bit of money, and they take children and they raise them, they give them an education, they give them friends and a roof over their head, and eventually they'll either be adopted by someone else or they will be taken back by their mother once the mother is able to take responsibility when the mother's older and has a bit more money. And that's what Bess is planning. She has just given birth, and that same day her dad takes her to the Foundling Hospital and makes her give up this newborn baby, Clara. Bess doesn't want to do this, but she also knows she doesn't really have a choice. She's very, very poor. She cannot look after the child. It's what her dad has told her to do, and she works for him, and it's fine, okay. Tugs on your heartstrings, but she has a plan. 5 years' time, she will come back, and she will take Clara back. That's her plan. Unfortunately, as the blurb states, I'm not giving anything away, when she goes back to the hospital, her child has already been taken by her. So we have this wonderful mystery. Now, when I read the blurb, I got really, really excited because this felt kind of supernatural or some sort of mistaken identity. Maybe she has an evil twin or something. I was really, really excited. And actually, the book is a lot more grounded than that. It's not as supernatural as I hoped it would be. It's not supernatural at all. As I've said before, neither of them are. But it had enough of a central hook to get me excited. And what actually happens is probably arguably more interesting than what was going on in my mind, my imagination. Once we've got that, Bess is brokenhearted, and we suddenly move to our other protagonist, Alexandra. Alexandra is a very, very wealthy widow. She lives in a nice part of London, and she has this young child, Charlotte. When we move to Alexandra's perspective, her part of the story, she takes on what are they called? Jane Eyre was one. Governess. Yeah, she takes on a governess. This governess is called Eliza. Now, I read this book at Christmas. I actually read it on Christmas Day, or I started on Christmas Day. And so it's been a few months, and I now cannot remember if I'm spoiling it by revealing that Bess is Eliza. But I'm pretty sure that is made very, very clear at the beginning. It wasn't a reveal to me. Was I supposed to know it? I obviously knew it. Was it intentional? I'm sure it was. They're at a church. Okay, so Bess is at a church. And she's at a church and she knows this doctor. And the doctor introduces her to Alexandra. But I remember that you see that part from Alexandra's perspective. So it switches perspective. And then Bess is introduced. And then she says that her name is Eliza. And she gets into the house. And it's kind of... there are things that Alexandra doesn't know that aren't spoken, but it's very obvious that we're supposed to know them. I'm pretty sure they're not twists. I hope they're not twists. Anyway, I'm going to talk about it. Spoiler warning. I don't think it's supposed to be a spoiler. I can't remember. I'm panicking now. I'm just going to talk about it anyway. So Bess, or Eliza, becomes the governess of this household, and that's because she knows that the child, Charlotte, Alexandra's child, 5 years old, is actually Clara, is actually Bess's child. Somehow, Bess's child has ended up in this rich widow's home and is now called Charlotte. And so Bess gets a job as a governess, she lives in this house, she works in this house, and she gets to be close to her child and figure out how her child has ended up in this home and what the story is about Alexandra. She's a widow and who her husband was and what her situation is, and it's kind of building a relationship between the two of them while also digging around in Bess's recent past and Alexandra's more distant past. And it works really, really well. You go from Bess's perspective to Alexandra's, back to Bess's eventually in the third act. And as I've said, the ending is a bit too much of a neat little bow on everything, but it's a fantastic journey to get there. The relationship between the two of them is fantastic. They are beautifully well written and dimensionalized characters. And Stacey Halls now, with this book, she goes a little bit heavier on the class differences. In The Foundling, the class differences weren't explored as well as they could have been, but here, because you have two different perspectives, two different narrators, two different protagonists of very distinctly different classes, both London women, each in very different states. You know, one is young, the other is a middle-aged widow. One is desperately trying to get her child back, the other has the child and is very stern in the way that she treats her. A very interesting central conceit of Alexandra's story is that she is pretty much an agoraphobe. She's terrified of going outside, and so she keeps Charlotte in the house with her. She is obsessed with keeping the doors closed, and she doesn't go out, and she doesn't allow her child to go out except on Sundays to church, and that's it. So interesting. I won't really tell you any more, but I will say that of the two, I thought The Foundling was pretty much a brilliant development of what was started here. The Familiars is a great debut novel, but The Foundling is a really excellent novel in its own right. So good, great. She has grown as an author, she's grown as a narrator, she's grown in terms of her language, and that's one other thing, is I think The Foundling is beautifully written. I think The Familiars is good enough commercial historical fiction. The Foundling is quite poetically written. She's really stepped up her game in terms of narrative, in terms of emotional writing. She's more careful with the words that she uses, and they're more beautiful. They're more elegant and eloquent. I think that her writing here really shines, and The Foundling has pushed her into outstanding author territory. In fact, Cosmo called her the new Hilary Mantel. Take what you will from that. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet, which I do want to bring up right at the end, is that this, as I've said, these books have very specific themes that overlap. Class, they're both set in distant past centuries, 17th and 18th centuries. They're both about women, they're both about class differences, and they're both about children. One is about a woman who keeps miscarrying and spends the entire novel pregnant. The other, The Foundling, is about two women, one child, lost child, desperately trying to get her child back, obsessively controlling and keeping the child indoors. The child, Charlotte/Clara, is the central fulcrum of this novel. Everything twists and turns around this child, and the same for The Familiars. Everything twists and turns around the fact that Fleetwood is pregnant and afraid of being a mother, afraid of letting down her husband, afraid of dying in childbirth, afraid of miscarrying again. Everything rides on her being a successful mother and managing to survive childbirth. So they are completely about children and birth and pregnancy and being a mother. And the funny thing is, I am terrified of children. The older I get, the more I realise this to be true. I am really frightened of children. I used to be a school teacher. Can you tell? I feel a lot of negative feelings around children. I'm not a fan. And this becomes more and more awkward as I get older, because all of my friends are having children, all of my friends are parents now, or they will be parents at some point, and I feel more and more guilty and awkward and ashamed and all these negative feelings for the fact that I can't stand being around children. I'm terrified of them. They make me nervous. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because these are two novels by one author which are all about parenthood and children and giving birth, carrying children, becoming a parent. The themes of these two books are very heavily about parenthood and children. And I hate that stuff. But I love these books, and it's the characters that bring the narrative to life and make me care. Just a point for me to bring up at the end. As someone who cannot stand children, is terrified of them and doesn't want them, I still love these books. So that's a selling point. Even if there's a thing in the books that you don't like, you'll probably like them anyway, because the narrative, the strength of the characters, the historical setting, the grounded nature of the plot, and the really, really beautiful writing, especially in The Foundling, will carry it all through for you. So that's my selling point, if that is one. Also, one other selling point, and it really helped me, is that these are two of the most beautiful book covers I think I've ever seen in my entire life. Clearly both designed by the same person, not sure who it was, should have looked that up. Absolutely gorgeous book covers, especially in hardback. They are really something special. I love them to pieces. Alright, more great historical fiction from me for you by Stacey Halls. You're welcome. Good. Subscribe for books.